Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening as the shadows lengthen and the world settles into its quiet repose? Allow me to draw you back across the passing of generations to a time governed not by clocks of metal and gears, but by the relentless, truthful journey of the sun across the sky and the deep, abiding patience of the soil. This is the tale of the Hawthorne farmstead, nestled deep within the fertile valleys of the 19th century, where every day unfolded like a careful hymn dedicated to the earth, a rhythm learned long ago by the hands and the heart alike. Life here was simple only in its materials, yet infinitely complex in its relentless dedication, demanding a surrender to the season's command and a profound respect for the slow unfolding of time. The first stirring of the Hawthorne household always began long before the eastern ridge blushed with the rising sun, an hour known only by the cooling ashes of the night fire and the deep, instinctual promptings of the creatures in the barn. It was a silence filled with purpose, broken first by the heavy scrape of a wooden latch, then the measured footfalls of the farmer, Elias, moving across the wide plank floors, carrying a lantern whose tiny flame seemed to push back the encompassing darkness with hesitant determination. This initial light was a sacred beacon, acknowledging the great task of the day that lay ahead, a silent agreement between man and labor that required fortitude long before warmth arrived. His breath plumed white in the cold air of the kitchen, a gentle vapor disappearing back into the quiet room as he sought the kindling necessary to wake the hearth once more. The kitchen hearth was the very heart of the home, the unblinking, warm eye around which all existence revolved, dictating the warmth of the bread and the comfort of the bedding. Soon, the aroma of burning oak and the rich, dark smell of roasting coffee beans began to twine together, a signal to the sleeping house that sustenance was being prepared, a promise of strength against the morning chill that still clung to the window panes. Mary, the farmer's wife, soon joined him, her movements practiced and economical as she stirred the thick pot of porridge and tended the heavy iron skillet, preparing the nourishment required to fuel bodies that would perform grueling, honest work until sunset. She moved with a quiet dignity, knowing that her toil within these four walls was just as essential as the strength wielded by the plow outside, providing the unseen anchor that kept the whole enterprise from drifting. Outside, in the sprawling, shadowy depths of the barn, Elias moved among the stalls, greeting his livestock with low murmurs, a recognition of their partnership in this hard-scrabble existence. The cows stirred, their heavy, muscled bodies shifting in the straw, and the air immediately grew thick with the clean scent of hay and the earthy steam of their breath in the frigid air. The milking was a deep, meditative ritual performed by the yellow glow of the lantern, the rhythmic psh, psh of the milk hitting the pail, a sound as ancient as the farm itself, signifying the immediate and tangible reward of their care. He carried the heavy pails back toward the house, feeling the deep pull in his arms and the certainty in his mind that the day had truly begun now that this first offering had been secured. Once the initial chores were done and the sky had finally given way to a bright, cold blue, Elias took to the fields, harnessing the great, patient strength of the draft horse, Bess, who knew the feel of the leather straps and the sound of his voice better than any human command. The plowshare bit into the dormant earth, turning over long, even ribbons of dark, wet soil, releasing the rich, heady perfume of decay and promise. This act was not merely labor, but a philosophical undertaking, the slow, repetitive turning of the world, preparing the ground for seeds that held the silent promise of next winter's survival. He walked behind the plow for hours, his gaze fixed on the sharp edge of the furrow, his mind cleared of all concerns save the straightness of the line and the steady rhythm of Bess's hooves against the clay. Midday brought a brief, profound cessation of movement, marked by the powerful, relentless light of the high summer sun beating down upon the newly tilled land, causing the dust motes to dance wildly in the porch light. Mary brought out thick slices of salted pork, fresh bread, and cool well water, which they ate silently together, seated on the worn wooden steps overlooking the sweeping expanse of their domain. The silence was not empty, but heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement of shared exhaustion and the profound satisfaction that comes only from having spent one's entire strength in a worthy cause, replenishing the body not just with food, but with a deep draught of gratitude for the very moment of rest. They watched the distant shadows of the clouds crawl slowly across the fields, markers of time slower and vaster than any human measure. The children, 10-year-old Thomas and his younger sister Sarah, were not idle observers in this adult world, but essential, though smaller, cogs in the farm's ceaseless machinery, learning the sacred necessity of contribution from the earliest age. Thomas spent his afternoon in the woodlot, sawing lengths of falling timber and stacking the resulting logs high and neat, his small hands blistering quickly, teaching him the immutable lessons of leverage and persistence. Sarah was tasked with gathering the precious, warm eggs from the nesting boxes, her skirt held carefully to cradle the delicate bounty, and bringing cool water from the spring house, tasks that required vigilance and care, instilling in them both a deep respect for the fragility and value of every resource the farm yielded. As the sun began its slow, inevitable descent, bathing the western sky in hues of deep orange and soft rose, the day's final, crucial preparations began, ensuring the safety and comfort of the homestead through the long, mysterious darkness. Elias finished mending a broken fence rail, driving the heavy posts deep into the earth with ringing blows that echoed across the quiet pasture, securing the boundary between the domesticated world and the untamed wilderness that lay beyond the sightline. He then led the animals back into the barn, spreading fresh straw and checking the water troughs one final time, tucking the farm into sleep with the thoroughness of a shepherd watching over his most precious flock. Finally, the fire banked down to a quiet, glowing heart. The tallow lamps snuffed out one by one, giving way to the profound, star-studded darkness that pressed close against the window panes. The sounds of the day, the rattle of the cart, the hammer against the wood, the lowing of the cow, were replaced by the softer, more mysterious acoustics of the night. The distant hoot of an owl, the ceaseless chirping of the field crickets, and the gentle sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass. Elias and Mary lay in their bed, feeling the blessed weight of honest exhaustion settle upon their limbs, grateful for the deep, restorative peace that only a life lived in accordance with nature's hard demands could truly bestow, waiting patiently for the first light to call them forth again into their endless, fruitful cycle. This nightly return to silence was the farm's most eloquent sermon, preaching the enduring truth that all labor eventually must yield to rest, and that the deepest sleep is earned not by idleness, but by the relentless, purposeful expenditure of one's strength under the vast and watchful sky. They knew that their lives were but a brief passage in the long history of the soil, temporary stewards charged with the profound responsibility of tending the life force that flowed beneath the surface, preparing it for the generations yet to come who would take up the same tools and walk the same patient furrows in the enduring pursuit of life. The rhythmic breathing of the sleeping family merged with the quiet heartbeat of the farmhouse, a small, warm pulse within the great, cold expanse of the world, ready to greet the new dawn whenever it chose to break over the eastern ridge. Thomas, dreaming lightly in his small attic room, often heard the far-off whistle of the midnight train, a lonely sound that cut briefly through the settled silence, reminding him that a different world existed beyond their valley, a world of speed and smoke and change. But here, on the Hawthorne land, time moved deliberately, bound by the slow rotation of the seasons, the frozen stillness of winter giving way to the rushing torrents of spring planting, followed by the languid, heavy heat of the summer harvest, and finally the golden decay of autumn's gathering. This predictability was not monotony, but security, a profound covenant with the cycles that had sustained humankind for centuries, teaching humility through necessity and faith through observation of the miracle of the seed. Mary, waking briefly in the deepest hour before dawn, would often steal a moment to look out the small window toward the distant shadow of the barn, finding comfort in the knowledge that every tool was hung in its proper place, every animal sheltered, and every task completed to the best of their human ability. She understood that farming was not a battle against nature, but a continuous negotiation, a delicate balance where vigilance and gratitude were equally necessary. For a sudden storm or a prolonged drought could undo months of back-breaking effort in a single, cruel moment. Yet, that very fragility fostered a resilient strength in the family, uniting them against the unpredictability of the elements and teaching them the true meaning of reliance upon one another and upon a providence greater than themselves. The tools themselves held a sacred weight, each handle polished smooth by the sweat and grip of repeated use across decades, imbued with the memory of hands long gone. The heavy iron-headed hammer, the well-worn leather of the horse harness, the thick, familiar heft of the scythe. These were not mere implements, but extensions of their own bodies, partners in the dance of creation and preservation. Elias would spend rainy days meticulously sharpening the edges of his blades or oiling the wooden handles, a quiet act of respect for the instruments that sustained their lives, ensuring that when the sun returned, the toil would be efficient and the sacrifice of muscle would yield the fullest return. He knew that dull tools invited unnecessary suffering, while care of the instrument was care of the future harvest. Sarah, as she grew taller and stronger through the years, transitioned from egg gathering to assisting her mother with the larger domestic arts, learning the complex magic of preserving the summer's bounty for the lean months of winter. She stood beside Mary in the late summer kitchen, which became thick and fragrant with the steam of boiling fruit and vinegar, sealing hundreds of jars filled with pickles, jellies, and sauces, tiny, perfect globes of captured sunshine. This annual endeavor was a profound act of foresight and devotion, turning perishable gifts into enduring insurance, teaching the young girl the essential rhythm of abundance and scarcity, and the wisdom of preparation against the coming cold. The social life of the Hawthorne family was woven tightly into the fabric of the community, relying upon neighboring families for shared labor and companionship, recognizing that no farm could truly stand alone against the massive demands of the harvest season. When the time came for the great threshing, the Hawthornes and the surrounding homesteads would gather, turning the fields into a flurry of collective action, the air filled with the dust of the grain and the cheerful shouts of dozens of hands working in unison. These days of communal effort were a powerful reminder of their interconnectedness, reinforcing the deep, unwritten code of mutual aid that was the bedrock of rural 19th-century life, sealing friendships with the shared ache of muscle and the relief of a shared success. The philosophical center of this existence lay in the understanding that everything returned to its source, that nothing was wasted, and that every material object had a purpose until it could serve no more. Worn clothing became patches, then rag rugs, and finally scraps for the fire. Spoiled grain fed the chickens. Ashes fertilized the garden. This relentless recycling was not born of poverty alone, but from a profound wisdom that respected the limited resources provided by the earth, instilling a thrifty and reverent perspective that viewed wastefulness as a spiritual error. They moved through their lives with this awareness of cyclical transformation, seeing their own bodies, eventually, as part of that great return to the fertile ground. Even the moments of quiet contemplation were tied inextricably to the land. Sitting on the porch in the cooling evening, Elias would watch the shadows stretch long across the pasture grass, considering the resilience of the roots beneath the soil that survived the harshest frost, waiting patiently for the thaw. He recognized his own strength mirrored in that unyielding plant life, understanding that true permanence was not found in static wealth or fleeting achievement, but in the steady, season-after-season commitment to growth, decay, and rebirth. This was the silent teaching of the Hawthorne Farm, that life, while hard and demanding, was fundamentally good, because it was true to the laws of the universe itself. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The late summer sun, though still warm, began to angle differently across the fields, signaling a crucial shift in the rhythm of Hawthorne farm life, transforming the frantic energy of planting and tending into the sober industry of preservation. This period was Martha's season of relentless command, for she presided over the sacred alchemy of the kitchen and the larder, turning the transient bounty of the earth into the sustained survival necessary for the long months ahead. The air was heavy with the sweet, tart steam of boiling apple preserves and the sharp scent of vinegar pickling cucumbers, reflecting the organized chaos through which she moved with the efficiency of a high priestess tending the flames of life. She knew intimately the weight of responsibility that lay in those sealed jars and dried-hung herbs, understanding that the health and continuance of the family rested not on luck, but on her diligent hand, ensuring not one fruit or root went to waste. This immense labor required a different kind of strength than Elias's toil in the fields, demanding not brute force, but unwavering patience and an understanding of chemical transformation, a quiet endurance that extended from dawn until the last sputtering oil lamp was quenched. She spent days bent over the copper-preserving kettle, stirring the thick fruit mash until her arms ached, visualizing the stored sunshine that would feed her children when the world outside turned gray and unforgiving. Her work was the ultimate expression of the farm's foundational truth that the present moment of abundance must be meticulously utilized to safeguard the future, making every jar sealed a silent covenant with the coming hardship. This deep connection to the cycle meant she never saw her duties as endless repetition, but rather as necessary links in the unbroken chain of existence. The children, too, were drawn deeply into this preparatory season, learning their roles not through explicit lessons, but through the necessity of helping hands, thereby absorbing the foundational wisdom of the farm simply by participating in its survival. Young Thomas, barely tall enough to see over the wooden chopping block, was tasked with helping Elias secure the winter's fuel, stacking cords of split oak with exacting precision beneath the shelter of the woodshed eaves. Elias insisted that the stack be perfectly straight and crisscrossed, allowing the wind to pass through and cure the wood fully, explaining patiently that a shoddy stack invited rot and instability, a lesson that applied as much to the timber as it did to a man's character. This painstaking work taught the boy that efficiency was a byproduct of careful deliberation, and that a straight line required more effort than a crooked one, but offered far greater assurance of lasting success. Meanwhile, the older daughter, Sarah, was assigned the task of stripping the excess corn husks, preparing the cobs for shelling, working rhythmically alongside her mother in the dim, cool shelter of the porch. Martha used these shared hours not merely for labor, but for passing on the oral history of their stewardship, recounting tales of past winters where only meticulous storage and careful rationing had prevented true suffering, instilling a deep respect for the husked grain they handled. Sarah learned to gauge the quality of the kernels by the feel beneath her thumb, recognizing the difference between grain fit for the mill and that destined for the livestock, understanding that discernment was a prerequisite to prudent management. She absorbed the quiet dignity Martha lent to the work, recognizing that true wealth lay not in what they acquired, but in what they successfully husbanded against the lean times. However, even the most prepared life held moments of unforeseen failure and physical test, demanding a return to the underlying resilience that Elias had recognized in the enduring pasture roots. One morning, while attempting to tighten the brake on the heavy wagon used for hauling fodder, the main bolt, weakened by years of strain and weather, snapped suddenly with a metallic crack that echoed painfully across the silent yard. A lesser man might have raged at the wasted time and the cost of replacement, but Elias allowed only a brief sigh, recognizing the inevitability of decay and material failure that was simply another facet of the Earth's relentless cycle. He gathered the broken pieces carefully, immediately calculating how the old iron could be forged or refitted, viewing the setback not as an obstacle, but as an immediate call for applied ingenuity and patient repair. He dedicated the afternoon to the repair, heating the heavy pieces in the small forge he kept near the barn, manipulating the stubborn metal with a heavy hammer, the rhythmic clang a counterpoint to the quiet industry of the kitchen. He took profound satisfaction in heating the iron until it glowed with an honest orange heat, knowing that this act of mending was a direct affirmation of his belief that everything possessed the potential for rebirth, requiring only effort and skilled attention to restore its usefulness. By evening, the bolt was replaced, not with a new store-bought piece, but with a stronger, hand-forged component that carried the unique signature of his struggle and success, a material testament to the value of self-sufficiency. This small triumph over mechanical failure reinforced his conviction that dependence on outside sources weakened the soul, whereas self-reliance strengthened both the hands and the spirit. As the first true bite of autumn crispness settled into the mornings, the community gathered for the annual threshing bee, a boisterous, necessary convergence of neighbors bound together by mutual need and the shared desire to defeat the impending winter. Wagons piled high with sheaves arrived from the surrounding farms, creating a landscape of golden stacks around Elias's barn, while the air filled with the dust of the grain and the sound of laughter and shouted instructions. The collective rhythm of the threshing machine, driven by shared horsepower and muscle, was a powerful, tangible symbol of the strength found in unified labor, highlighting the profound truth that no farm, however self-sufficient, could ultimately survive in isolation. They shared not only the labor and the equipment, but also the deep knowledge accumulated over generations, debating the best time for sowing, the effectiveness of various fertilizers, and the signs of approaching weather, solidifying the bonds of shared success. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery orange and calming violet, the exhausted farmers gathered around long, hastily built tables for a massive, communal supper provided by the wives, a feast earned by the sweat of the brow. The conversation was simple and grounded, revolving around the tangible realities of their lives, the health of their livestock, the yield of the potato harvest, the price of lumber in the nearest town, discussions rooted entirely in the immediate world around them. It was during these moments of communal repose that the deepest spiritual lesson of their lives became most apparent, that their shared existence was bound by a sacred commitment to hard work, honest dealing, and the absolute necessity of caring for one another through the inevitable cycles of plenty and scarcity. After the neighbors had departed, taking their share of milled grain and leaving behind only the rich dust of the day's endeavor, Elias would stand alone in the cooling darkness, looking up at the wheeling expanse of the late September sky, the stars now appearing sharp and numerous. He found a profound quietude in the immense scale of the cosmos, recognizing that his own small, ordered world, the barn secured, the grain protected, the family sleeping soundly, was a tiny, perfect reflection of that vast, incomprehensible order above. The struggles of the day, the snapped bolt, the heavy lifting, the unending demands, all faded into insignificance when viewed against the backdrop of eternity. Yet they simultaneously gained monumental importance as the essential, faithful actions required to maintain his small, beloved corner of the universal truth. This nightly communion with the silent heavens reinforced his understanding that true faith was not a matter of abstract theological debate, but a practical expression found in the daily commitment to stability, structure, and endurance, mirroring the unchanging patterns of the stars. He knew that the only real security lay not in fleeting material comfort, but in the certainty of knowing one had done the required work, aligning one's efforts perfectly with the laws of nature that governed both the planting of a seed and the movement of the celestial spheres. As the temperature dropped, carrying the first icy scent of true winter on the north wind, Elias would finally turn inward, breathing in the warm, yeasty smell of curing grain rising from the depths of the storage bins, the smell of life fully prepared and awaiting its next passage. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Elias drew the massive oak door closed behind him, the heavy latch falling into place with a definitive solid sound that seemed to seal the warmth inside and push the vast, indifferent cold of the night away. The transition from the silent, freezing dark outside to the yellow, lamp-lit warmth of the kitchen was profound, a sudden return to the protective center of his terrestrial world, where the cast-iron hearth still glowed softly like a banked ember heart. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man whose body demanded rest, but whose mind was still cataloging the day's work, checking the damper on the main stove one last time, ensuring the deep bed of residual coals held their heat until the first light of morning, a small, essential ritual repeated thousands of times that anchored the passage of time within the stability of his home. The air inside smelled richly of pine resin, dried herbs hanging above the mantel, and the faint, sweet trace of baked apples consumed hours earlier, a domestic perfume far more comforting than the earthy smells of the freshly secured fields. Elias would move silently toward the rear of the house, where the children slept deeply under heavy patchwork quilts. Pausing first by the trundle bed near the stove, where their youngest daughter rested for the warmest spot. He often stood there for a long moment, watching their small chests rise and fall in the measured rhythm of deep, innocent sleep, contemplating the future strength that would one day be theirs, and the heavy mantle of responsibility they would inherit alongside the land. It was in these quiet late-night observations that the philosophical truths he grasped beneath the remote light of the winter stars coalesced into tangible form. The true legacy was not merely the acres held, but the disciplined character formed by working that land, the profound understanding of necessity over fleeting luxury, and the courage to endure the inevitable lean times. As the true chill finally settled in mid-November, locking the ground hard and pushing the family exclusively into the interior spaces of the farmhouse, Elias moved his essential work from the open air into the small, dedicated workshop attached directly to the back of the woodshed, where a smaller, focused forge was carefully kept banked. This period marked the true beginning of the season of craftsmanship, a time dedicated not to the soft, yielding nature of the earth, but to the hard, unyielding physics of iron and seasoned wood, focused entirely upon sharpening and restoring the tools that would inevitably awaken the fields again in the upcoming spring. Each precise, focused hammer blow against the softened, glowing iron, reforming the tired edge of a plowshare or straightening a heavily stressed hinge, was a direct, tactile commitment to future efficiency, a focused meditation on perfecting the means of production long before the demand for them returned. He spent long, solitary, meditative hours smoothing the rough grain of salvaged oak and resilient ash, carefully mending wagon wheels whose spokes had inevitably cracked under the crushing loads of the summer harvest, or precisely crafting sturdy new sled runners from hickory wood for hauling necessary timber across the expected frozen expanse of the fields. The sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut wood shavings mingled intoxicatingly with the pungent odor of coal smoke, hot oil, and scorched iron, creating the complex, unique olfactory signature of winter survival and necessary preparation. Elias always sought the inherent resistance and the quiet wisdom embedded within the materials themselves, recognizing that forcing the wood would inevitably lead to immediate splintering and failure, but working patiently with its natural bend and grain ensured a deep, lasting strength that could withstand the demands of the decades. Meanwhile, Clara and the older girls were ceaselessly engaged in the equally demanding indoor labor, the continuous, quiet industry that was absolutely essential to sustaining the family through the inescapable lean months that lay ahead. They spent many long, intense days spinning the newly shorn, cleaned wool into thick, durable threads, often dipping the enormous skeins into deep vats of home-brewed dye made carefully from dark walnut hulls gathered in autumn, or the vibrant red of imported madder root, skillfully transforming the mundane, beige fiber into necessary color and deep, lasting warmth. The constant, repetitive rhythm of the spinning wheel filled the main room like a giant, purposeful clock, its hypnotic, monotonous whirring a persistent reminder of the continuous, unglamorous effort required daily to clothe and protect those sheltered within the thick stone walls. When the first true, heavy blizzard arrived, falling silently and without warning, it inevitably muffled the entire world outside entirely beneath a thick blanket of deep, crystalline snow, and an unparalleled, profound silence descended upon the farmstead, broken only by the comforting, domestic crackle of the fireplace and the deep, contented breathing of the heavily sheltered livestock in the massive, secured barn. Elias always appreciated this profound, imposed stillness, finding it fundamentally necessary for the restoration and realignment of the soul, a profound time when the aggressive, outward energy of planting and reaping could finally and healthily turn inward toward deeper reflection, careful budgeting, and precise planning. He would sit for hours by the small, frosted window, watching the flakes descend in mesmerizing, countless patterns, understanding deeply that this period of dormancy was not a sign of death or failure, but a necessary, mandated gathering of strength, a profound repose that was mandated entirely by the very rhythm of existence itself. He would sit for hours by the small, frosted window, watching the flakes descend in mesmerizing, countless patterns, understanding deeply that this period of dormancy was not a sign of death or failure, but a necessary, mandated gathering of strength, a profound repose that was mandated entirely by the very rhythm of existence itself. This enforced domestic quiet was also the perfect time for the annual, careful review of the incoming seed catalogs, thin, glossy paper booklets delivered slowly by the winter post, bearing illustrations of impossible bounty and great promise upon their pages. Spreading the catalogs out across the smoothed kitchen table under the direct glow of the central lamp, Elias and Clara would engage in serious discussion of next year's necessary crop rotation, tracing anticipated patterns with their worn fingers across the aged map of their fields, carefully deciding which specific plots would lie fallow for the needed replenishment, and which would bear the hungry, soil-demanding root vegetables. These hours of meticulous planning were far more than simple practical calculation. They were profound acts of enduring hope and abiding faith, a commitment firmly made to the future harvest months before the ground had even begun to thaw, demanding that they vividly envision spring while the punishing grip of the deepest frost still held the land utterly captive. The long, deep evenings grew exceptionally dark, inviting the necessary retelling of old stories, the vital traditions passed down not through dusty, fragile books, but through the comforting, rhythmic cadence of the firelit room, connecting the present generation directly to the ancestral struggles. Elias would speak often of his own grandfather's legendary struggles against devastating locust plagues and unforeseen, destructive early frosts, weaving elaborate narratives of deep human resilience and the relentless, demanding, and uncompromising spirit of the very land they worked. These stories served as essential, vital instruction, teaching the children early that every generation must confront its own unique and defining hardship, and that the only reliable, trustworthy shield against overwhelming misfortune was inherited wisdom married to an unwavering personal fortitude and a profound respect for the natural cycles. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Little Thomas, his eyes wide with the flickering shadows cast by the great fire, would often study the worn tools hanging neatly on the heavy shed wall, the polished axe head, the chipped edge of the massive broad shovel, the rust-flecked tines of the hay fork, seeing in them not merely instruments of daily toil, but artifacts profoundly infused with the sweat, the enduring prayers, and the immense collective struggle of 3 entire generations of his farming lineage. His father, Elias, taught the boy during the bitterly cold, frozen afternoons how to properly sharpen the scythe blade, instructing him to move the whetstone across the metal with a meditative, slow, consistent rhythm, explaining clearly that true, lasting sharpness lay not in aggressive brute force, but rather in patience and the precise, intuitive understanding of the metal's ancient, stubborn grain. This careful, measured maintenance during the long period of deep winter inactivity ensured that when the first tentative calls of the demanding spring season arrived, they would not be found wanting or unprepared, but instead entirely ready to meet the sudden, grueling rush of necessary labor with tools that functioned flawlessly as seamless extensions of their own determined, focused will. Meanwhile, in the central living room, where the enormous stone hearth cast its perpetual, deep orange glow upon the rough-hewn floorboards, Martha, Elias's wife, directed the ceaseless, quiet industry that was absolutely essential to keep the entire household fully whole and nourished throughout the enduring hardships of the merciless cold season. Her hands, perpetually calloused yet surprisingly nimble, moved with practiced, almost silent grace across the warp and weft of the wooden loom, spinning thick, insulating wool gathered over the previous year into essential, durable blankets and heavy, protective cloth desperately needed to withstand the relentless, biting winter winds that howled fiercely around the rattling window frames. She taught her 2 daughters the meticulous, time-consuming art of rendering animal tallow for fresh candles, and the crucial, demanding skill of properly preserving the meager stored root crops and dried fruits, emphasizing profoundly that the prosperity and the very survival of the entire family rested just as heavily upon her own unwavering vigilance and her quiet, necessary industry as it did upon the sheer strength of the men's backs when they labored in the unforgiving, frozen fields. The profound silence of the land in the deepest depths of winter was an immense, heavy thing, broken only by the comforting, persistent sigh of the fire consuming the carefully seasoned oak, and the faint, low, melancholic creak of the old barn timbers settling under the oppressive, crushing weight of the accumulated, deep snowfall. Occasionally, if the wind blew just right, it would carry the distant, heavily muffled chime of the church bell from the far-off, small village, a solitary, cherished sound linking them briefly to the human world beyond their tightly bound acres. Yet mostly they existed within their own enclosed, highly self-sustaining bubble of necessary warmth and focused, rhythmic labor. This profound stillness, however, was not recognized as emptiness, but rather as a deep, essential reservoir for introspection and profound thought. A hallowed time when the human spirit, stripped bare of the noisy external demands of the burgeoning summer growth, could listen attentively to the steady, unhurried, vital rhythm of its own beating heart. On certain nights, when all the demanding chores were fully done, the animals settled, and the children had finally settled into their straw ticks near the dying, whispering embers, Elias would solemnly retrieve the family's single, heavily bound volume, a precious collection of psalms and ancient agrarian philosophies printed on thick, yellowed, fragile paper, and read its solemn contents aloud by the fragile, golden light of a single sputtering tallow candle. His voice, usually gruff and practical in the daylight, took on a measured, distinctly reverent tone as he slowly explored verses speaking of divine providence and the long, cyclical rotation of planting and reaping, reminding them all that human existence was merely a tiny, fleeting moment within the vast, eternal, and predictable movement of the distant, silent celestial spheres. He would pause frequently, allowing the profound philosophical weight of the concepts he had read to settle deeply into the quiet, attentive minds assembled before him, firmly reinforcing the enduring truth that merely enduring through the relentless cold was itself a silent, persistent prayer, a sacred testament to their readiness to accept the full, uncompromising terms of their difficult earthly tenancy. The massive, sturdy draft horses and the small, essential herd of milk cows, sheltered carefully in the deep, steaming warmth of the sturdy barn, were accorded a status within the household that bordered upon revered, for their perfect health and continued immense vitality were inextricably linked to the family's ability to survive until the first new grass grew again upon the high, exposed pastures. Thomas was tasked daily with carrying warm, nutritious mash and fresh, clean, unfrozen water to the valuable beasts, brushing down the horses' thick, shaggy winter coats until the hair shone dully yet warmly in the dim lamplight, learning early in life that the true farmer's heart must hold deep, genuine affection and profound responsibility for the powerful, essential creatures whose strength and labor they wholly borrowed. These quiet, necessary visits to the barn were meditative, deeply grounding acts, conducted faithfully in the heavy, pervasive, sweet-smelling air of dry hay and steaming animal breath, serving as a necessary, constant commitment to the precious life forces that slept soundly within the protective wooden walls, waiting patiently for the inevitable return of the lengthening light. Sometime near the exact midpoint of the punishing cold, when the vast reserves of firewood stacked neatly against the outer wall began to show their diminishing, worrying edges, a solitary, weather-beaten traveler, perhaps a desperate post-rider or a rare passing peddler seeking brief shelter, would deposit a thin, precious packet wrapped carefully in oiled paper, usually containing the eagerly awaited, brightly illustrated seed catalog sent expensively from the distant urban centers. Unfolding this catalog at the rough-hewn kitchen table was immediately an occasion marked by genuine, palpable excitement, an instantaneous psychological escape from the immediate scarcity and gloom, allowing every member of the family to travel instantly forward in their minds to the abundant, hopeful greenness of the coming June. They would trace their hardened fingers across the elaborate descriptions of new, hardy strains of feed corn and deep red tomato varieties, their conversation instantly turning excitedly from the grim realities of the freezing present to the imaginative, demanding, and promising necessities of the approaching agricultural year. They would trace their hardened fingers across the elaborate descriptions of new, hardy strains of feed corn and deep red tomato varieties, their conversation instantly turning excitedly from the grim realities of the freezing present to the imaginative, demanding, and promising necessities of the approaching agricultural year. The most profound spiritual lesson that the winter consistently taught the farm family was the inescapable, demanding necessity of disciplined, unflinching patience, forcing them to conserve not only their physical stores of grain, dried meat, and rendered fat, but also their inherent emotional energies, suppressing the powerful, human urge to rush ahead or to fret excessively about the uncertain, unpredictable future. Every passing day was a careful, measured act of budgeting warmth, time, and essential human effort, ensuring with absolute certainty that nothing was ever wasted and that every single action contributed directly and measurably to the long-term survival of the whole communal enterprise, serving as a profound daily lesson in the humble acceptance of absolute limits. They understood inherently that the earth itself demanded this long, necessary period of absolute rest and restorative dormancy, and that the farmer who foolishly fought stubbornly against this powerful, natural rhythm was certain to be broken utterly by its uncompromising, immense strength, learning only hardship where quiet wisdom should have been willingly embraced. The small stores of preserved apples, carefully wrapped and hung high, began to show the dull, unavoidable marks of time, necessitating their transformation into spiced apple butter, a demanding labor that filled the air with the comforting, heavy scents of cinnamon and clove, aromas that temporarily masked the damp, earthy smell of the long-stored root vegetables buried beneath the cellar floor. This yearly ritual of preserving and reprocessing was a critical, precise exercise in utilizing every single last scrap, reflecting a deep respect for the sacrificed life of the plant and the sheer energy expended during the summer's intense labor, solidifying the family's understanding that true thrift was not merely the saving of money, but the respectful avoidance of all avoidable waste. Each jar sealed and set aside became a further commitment made to the future, a small, tangible hedge placed against the persistent, encroaching darkness of the deepest, leanest weeks that inevitably lay ahead before the final thaw. Though the massive snowbanks still towered aggressively outside the stout bolted door, and the very air seemed utterly brittle with the sharp, deep frost, Elias noted quietly to Martha during their shared evening meal that the essential quality of the midday sunlight, when it managed to penetrate the often heavy gray cloud cover, had subtly, almost imperceptibly, begun to change its character and its reach. It possessed a marginally brighter, more penetrating intensity now, holding within its fleeting golden rays a faint, undeniable promise of future warmth, no longer merely the weak, pale, despairing light of the shortest, darkest days, but carrying instead the quiet, insistent gravity of the sun's gradual, faithful, and necessary return. This slight, precious alteration in the light was a sacred, deeply trusted calendar marker, signaling the slow, majestic turning of the year, allowing a reserved, necessary optimism to bloom quietly yet resolutely within the sturdy, silent walls of their ancient farmhouse, patiently preparing their hearts for the tremendous, back-breaking labor that the grand, eventual rebirth of the land would soon relentlessly demand of them all. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Elias spent the long, lingering evenings when the lamplight cast deep, honeyed shadows across the worn, scrubbed floorboards, meticulously tending to the essential iron implements that had been carefully stored since the final harvest. He methodically honed the curved edges of the plowshares, rubbing down the cold metal with oily rags until they gleamed like dark mirrors, ensuring that the necessary keenness was restored to the steel that would soon be tasked with splitting the reluctant, heavy earth in long, straight furrows. This preparation was not merely a mundane chore, but a deeply meditative rite, a silent communion with the future fields, allowing him to anticipate the resistance of the soil and the eventual, satisfying sigh of the sod turning beneath the weight of the mule and the strength of his own hands. The harness leather, stiff and dry from months of disuse, was pulled from the hooks and laid across the workbench, where Elias gently worked nourishing oil into the thick, fibrous hide, restoring its necessary suppleness and strength. Every buckle was checked, every stitch scrutinized beneath the sharp glow of the lamp, for he knew well that a single broken strap under the immense strain of the spring plowing could halt the entire day's effort and inflict serious, needless injury upon the patient, straining beasts. This intimate handling of the tools brought him into profound physical contact with the rhythms of the previous year's labor and connected him firmly to the rigorous demands of the coming season, solidifying the unspoken contract between man and machine required to draw sustenance from the demanding land. Meanwhile, Martha sat by the hearth, often wrapped in an old woolen shawl against the lingering chill that seeped in from the stone chimney, spreading out the precious, carefully labeled packets of seeds that represented the entirety of their coming summer's bounty. She handled the tiny kernels of corn, beans, and squash with an almost devotional reverence, counting the stores against the known needs of the household, knowing that a single handful too many planted now could mean scarcity when the true yielding time arrived later in the autumn. She was measuring not merely volume, but hope itself, balancing the deep, inherent scarcity of their existence with the robust, unwavering promise written into the heart of every dormant seed, trusting utterly in the vast, benevolent generosity of the Creator's design. Thomas and Samuel, the older boys, were set to the task of cleaning and repairing the wooden seed drill and the two-wheeled farm cart, scraping away the dried mud and rust that had accumulated during the damp dormancy of the winter months. They learned through this quiet, repetitive labor that a farmer's worth was not measured by brute strength alone, but by his persistent capacity for meticulous maintenance, ensuring that nothing was ever left to chance when the vital planting season finally broke upon them like a sudden, demanding storm. The rhythmic scraping and sanding of the dry wood filled the farmhouse with a quiet, satisfying industry, a palpable sense of readiness that displaced the heavy, expectant silence of midwinter. When the sun had gained enough purchase to soften the crust of the snow just slightly, making the arduous travel possible without breaking through the drifts with every step, Elias and the older boys ventured out to the back woodlot to fell the remaining trees designated for the year's cooking and heating fuel. The bite of the sharp, cold steel axe against the frozen timber echoed with a different quality now, a louder, clearer report that seemed to travel further through the thinner, more breathable winter air, lacking the deadening silence of the deepest January frosts. This demanding labor of taking life for the sustenance of life provided necessary warmth twice over, once in the powerful, rhythmic exertion that heated the blood and sinews, and again in the slow, satisfying consumption of the dry, seasoned logs within the hungry iron belly of the stove. They dragged the heavy, freshly cut logs over the rapidly thinning snow crust back to the yard, stacking the timber high in perfect, orderly cord piles that stretched out like silent, brown monuments to their enduring stamina and foresight. Every log placed was an act of faith, a pledge that they would endure until the full, life-giving heat of summer could be trusted to sustain them without the costly, constant requirement of fire within the main hearth. The physical weight of the timber served as a solemn reminder of the ceaseless, ancient exchange, that human life on this difficult land could only persist through constant, respectful extraction from the deep, vast reservoir of nature's own uncompromising storehouse. Then, inevitably, arrived the first serious thaw, heralded by a subtle, unexpected softness that crept into the air late one afternoon, transforming the frigid, crystalline landscape into a dripping, chaotic world of water and wet earth. The deep, muffled silence that had reigned supreme for months was abruptly broken by the joyous, surging sound of the creek, now rushing and swollen, tearing through the last layers of ice with a vibrant, muscular roar that spoke of powerful, untamed motion and the irresistible force of flowing current. The farmyard instantly became a sodden, unforgiving sea of thick, viscous mud, clinging relentlessly to the heels of boots and staining the hem of every skirt. Yet this very messiness was welcomed as a necessary sacrifice required by the land before its miraculous awakening could truly begin. Within the deep shelter of the barn, the heavy scent of straw and warm animal breath now mingled with the sharp, clean smell of the outside thaw, signaling a new urgency among the overwintered livestock. The great cow, Bess, shifted restlessly in her stall, her heavy body preparing for the calving that was now only weeks away, demanding constant watchfulness from the boys, who took turns sleeping near the milking stalls, listening intently for the first signs of the tremendous labor. This period of imminent new birth was always steeped in a quiet, fearful anxiety, as the transition from winter's containment to spring's exposure often brought unexpected ailments, requiring the utmost vigilance to ensure that the fragile new lives were successfully brought forth into the harsh, demanding world. Martha now dedicated much of her early morning effort to turning out the hens into the still damp yard, encouraging them to move about and begin laying with greater frequency, as the light extended its welcome reach into the mornings and evenings. The sight of the pale, smooth eggs gathered in her basket felt like a small, triumphant echo of the larger fertility about to burst forth across the entire landscape, signaling the gradual return to abundance after the restrictive discipline of the leaner months. She relied heavily upon the nourishing, strengthening quality of these early spring eggs to sustain the family through the strenuous weeks of field preparation that lay immediately ahead, fueling their bodies for the inevitable, grinding labor. One morning, as Elias stood on the porch, inhaling the clean, damp fragrance of the melting snow, he heard a sound that pierced the residual weariness left by the long winter. The high, sweet, familiar call of the first returning meadowlark, perched boldly upon the skeletal branch of the tallest maple. This small, feathered herald was an unmistakable confirmation, a fragile yet insistent voice declaring the victory of life over the cold dominion of the grave-like frost, filling the quiet morning with a sound both ancient and utterly fresh. Down by the south-facing stone wall, where the snow always receded earliest, Martha discovered the deep green, tightly furled promise of the crocus shoots, pushing stubbornly up through the frozen earth, confirming that the silent, subterranean work of renewal had already been faithfully underway for many weeks beneath their very feet. In the quiet, late afternoon hours, Elias spread out the large, hand-drawn map of the 100 acres across the kitchen table, tracing the boundaries of his fields with a calloused finger, guided by generations of inherited knowledge and the wisdom contained within the dog-eared almanac. He carefully plotted the rotation of the crops, deciding where the thirsty oats would follow the demanding wheat, and where the necessary, restorative acres of fallow ground would be permitted to lie silent and replenish their stores for a future season's yield. This solemn act of agricultural cartography was the highest form of stewardship, a deep mathematical prayer made in anticipation of the immense necessary cooperation required between the farmer, the weather, and the rich, dark potential held within the ancient soil. Elias took the opportunity afforded by the muddy, unworkable ground to walk the perimeter of the farm with Thomas and Samuel. Not simply walking, but reading the subtle narrative of the land laid bare by the thaw. He taught them to discern the heavy, clay-rich sections from the lighter, sandier slopes, showing them where the water would pool and where the earth would retain its warmth most readily, instructing them patiently in the profound geography of their inheritance. He reminded them always that true farming was less about sudden effort and much more about patient observation, teaching them to listen to the silent, slow rhythms of the world and to work in profound harmony with the dictates of the season. He reminded them always that true farming was less about sudden effort and much more about patient observation, teaching them to listen to the silent, slow rhythms of the world and to work in profound harmony with the dictates of the season. They spoke not in modern calculations of yield and profit, but in the timeless language of the soil, discussing the proper depth for the seed, the significance of the angle of the sun at the spring equinox, and the proper, subtle timing of the first field fires to clear the previous year's stubble. The boys were learning to distinguish the faint, fertile scent of the warming earth from the sharper, sterile smell of the decaying leaf litter, internalizing the deep, necessary difference between the past and the tremendous, unavoidable labor of the present. This oral tradition was their most vital inheritance, far exceeding the value of the implements or the acreage itself, ensuring the survival of their lineage upon that stubborn patch of ground. Despite the burgeoning warmth and the eager readiness of their muscles for the tremendous effort ahead, there remained a necessary final period of restraint, a sacred pause known to every farmer before the soil was truly ready to receive the seed. The ground, though thawing on the surface, still held the deep, uncompromising chill of the departed winter in its heart, refusing to yield its potential until the sun had worked its profound alchemy completely. Elias understood that to rush the planting would be an act of arrogance, a transgression against the sacred timing of the year, and so they waited, poised on the edge of the great spring rush, storing their energy while the earth slowly, deliberately prepared to breathe again, waiting for the moment when the soil would be yielding enough to receive the plow's sharp kiss and hold the seed securely. Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? The sacred pause endured for 3 long days, marked by a quiet tension in the farmhouse, where every movement was measured and every word carefully considered, lest the hasty human spirit disrupt the greater, slower clockwork of the natural world. Elias spent those evenings not watching the sky, which could lie with sudden, cruel snow squalls, but kneeling in the dark earth, sifting handfuls of the damp soil through his calloused fingers, seeking the precise moment when the chill had retreated entirely from the subsurface clay. The true signal came not from the calendar, nor from the height of the emerging clover, but from a deeper resonance within the earth itself. The soil, when pressed, no longer held a stubborn, slick cohesion, but instead yielded and crumbled into loose, dark granules, holding a faint warmth like the breath of a sleeping animal. It was a sign understood by generations without needing spoken language, announcing that the time for reflection was over and the time for absolute effort had arrived. Before the first cut could be made, Elias brought the heavy, iron-shod plow from the cool shadows of the barn, treating the implement with the reverence due to a warrior's shield or a priest's chalice, for this tool was the bridge between hunger and abundance. He ran a whetstone along the hardened steel of the share until the edge gleamed with a dangerous silver sharpness, demanding that the boys, Thomas and Abel, watch the careful, rhythmic movements of his hands, learning the angle that ensured a clean, deep slice into the reluctant earth. The wooden stalk, worn smooth by decades of friction against the farmer's palm, was oiled anew, speaking silently of the long partnership between man, wood, and iron, preparing for the mighty task of overturning the stubborn winter's sleep. They checked the clevis pins and the traces, ensuring that no brittle leather or rusted metal would fail at the moment of greatest strain, knowing that once the plowing began, there could be no true rest until the entire acreage lay open and ready beneath the sun. The morning that followed the soil's signal dawned clear and crisp, edged with the scent of pine smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. But the air above the fields was already promising the immense, sweat-drenched heat of the coming day. Elias awoke the massive team of oxen, Jacob and Esau, named for their differing tempers but matched in their profound, steady strength, whose great, muscled shoulders were still stiff from the winter's relative idleness. The work of yoking the beasts was itself a meditative ritual, requiring patience, firm hands, and a deep mutual understanding, as the polished hardwood yoke was settled carefully upon their necks, transferring the plow's weight directly to the slow, relentless power of their magnificent frames. Thomas led Jacob, speaking to the enormous animal in a low, encouraging murmur that the beast seemed to understand perfectly, while Abel walked beside the heavy beam of the plow, carrying the necessary water skins and the sharpening tools. Elias grasped the handles of the plow, feeling the familiar, necessary weight settle into his hands, the wooden grips worn smooth by the repeated cycles of spring effort stretching back further than his own memory. He signaled Thomas with a simple, authoritative nod, and Thomas called the oxen forward with a long, drawn-out cry that cut through the silence of the field, setting the enormous animals into their slow, deliberate march. The moment the sharp iron blade bit into the resisting soil, there was a profound sound, a tearing, grating sound of earth surrendering its tightly held composure, followed immediately by the magnificent, rich smell of newly upturned soil releasing its trapped, fertile scent into the morning air. This first furrow was not merely a line in the dirt, but the defining mark of the season, a commitment laid upon the ground, demanding absolute straightness and a consistent, unyielding depth that reflected the farmer's unwavering dedication to the harvest that was still months away. The progress was achingly slow at first, the oxen struggling to find their rhythm as the heavy earth resisted the intrusion, requiring Elias to lean into the handles with all his weight, guiding the share around the buried stones and matted roots that fought to keep the soil bound. The plow served as a profound amplifier of the earth's resistance, transferring every subtle shift in soil composition directly up through the wood and into the muscles of the man guiding it, forcing him to gauge the subsurface density with a delicate balance of pressure and release. After perhaps an hour of effort, the great beasts began to settle into a steadier, powerful pace, their immense shoulders rolling under the strain of the yoke, pulling the plow with a slow momentum that became its own kind of heavy, unstoppable rhythm, defining the very essence of patient labor. With each pass, a long, dark ribbon of earth was peeled back and laid gently over the preceding row, creating the neat, waiting geometry that signaled the true commencement of the agricultural year. With each pass, a long, dark ribbon of earth was peeled back and laid gently over the preceding row, creating the neat, waiting geometry that signaled the true commencement of the agricultural year. The sun climbed steadily, turning the cool morning air into a searing weight upon the backs of the laborers, and soon the only sound besides the grating of the iron share was the heavy, labored breathing of the oxen and the soft, steady shush of Elias's worn leather boots sinking into the loose, broken soil. Thomas and Abel, though young and filled with boundless energy, quickly learned the unforgiving, demanding nature of the task, understanding that plowing was less a sprint of strength and more a marathon of unwavering, repetitive focus that demanded the same effort from the first row to the last. They learned that the true skill was not just in steering the team, but in maintaining the rhythm, ensuring the pace did not falter, and that the depth of the furrow remained perfectly consistent, regardless of whether the soil was soft and sandy or thick with ancient clay. The boys performed the crucial task of walking ahead to retrieve the stubborn rocks that had been brought to the surface, tossing them with a satisfying clang onto the growing stone pile at the field's edge, monuments to the earth's refusal to be easily mastered. As the heat intensified, Elias felt the deep, familiar ache settle into his shoulders and lower back, the necessary tax levied by the earth on any man who would dare disturb its slumber. But this pain was merely a background hum to the profound satisfaction of the work. He watched the ever-increasing expanse of dark, tilled earth spreading out behind them, realizing that in this act of turning over the soil, they were not just preparing a bed for seed, but were participating in an ancient, essential conversation with the forces that governed life and death. The air was thick with the scent of raw earth and animal sweat, a primal, compelling fragrance that spoke of productivity and the promise of sustenance, confirming that the farmer's true wealth lay not in coins, but in the dark, yielding fertility beneath his feet. He allowed himself only brief stops, primarily to let the oxen drink deep draughts from the buckets Abel carried, administering small, quiet acts of gratitude to the beasts who carried the immense burden of their survival upon their broad necks. By the time the sun began its long descent toward the western horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the newly tilled land, they had completed the central expanse of the main field, leaving behind an astonishing tapestry of dark, moist soil that seemed to drink the light. The sight of the finished work brought a deep, silent reverence to the men. The field, Previously a brown-gray expanse of winter stubble now lay dark and waiting, transformed by the power of the plow and the sheer, focused effort of man and beast working in unified purpose. Elias paused at the headland, wiping the sweat and dust from his brow, his body weary to the bone, but his spirit filled with the unique, quiet triumph that only honest labor can bestow, knowing that they had established the essential framework for the coming season's survival. The boys, exhausted yet exhilarated, were already learning that the true beauty of the farm lay not in its pastoral stillness, but in the visible record of relentless, purposeful action etched into the soil. The next stages of labor would involve the harrowing, the smoothing and breaking down of the larger clods left by the plow, an equally demanding task that would prepare the fine seedbed, and then, finally, the meticulous, back-breaking work of sowing itself. Elias knew that they must maintain this fierce momentum established on the first day, for the sun waited for no man, and the optimal window for planting was often measured in mere days before the ground became too dry or the late frosts returned with cruel indifference. As the oxen were led back to the barn, their flanks steaming in the cooling air, the farmer knew that he had performed his sacred duty to the land, initiating the cycle anew, trusting implicitly in the promise contained within the newly broken earth. He looked out over the furrows, already anticipating the feeling of the seed grain slipping through his fingers, a profound gesture of hope and faith directed toward the unseen future. The supper that evening was a quiet, celebratory affair, fueled not by fancy dishes, but by sheer, overwhelming hunger and the deep satisfaction of earned rest. The simple fare of boiled potatoes and salted meat never tasted so magnificent as after the first day of plowing. Thomas and Abel, though fighting sleep, listened intently as Elias recounted the day's work, praising their patience with the oxen and the straightness of the furrows they had maintained, instilling in them the understanding that diligence was the highest virtue required of a land steward. Elias emphasized that a crooked furrow meant wasted effort and that the field was a living ledger of a man's character. Show him the lines he plows, and you know the measure of his soul, for the earth would betray any carelessness or lack of attention to detail. The necessity of the plowing was not merely to overturn the soil, Elias explained to his sons before the oil lamp was extinguished, but to teach the boys the profound lesson of breaking through resistance, to show them that the greatest rewards required the greatest and most sustained effort against the forces of nature and inertia. The deep, heavy muscle fatigue was not a punishment, but a confirmation that their bodies had engaged fully with the earth, binding them inextricably to the destiny of that patch of land. They slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted farmer, a peace that was both restorative and fleeting, knowing that the sun would rise too quickly and the call of the field would demand their immediate return, compelling them back to the slow, magnificent, rhythmic labor of turning the world over, one profound ribbon of dark earth at a time. The work had begun, and it would not cease until the final harvest was gathered into the bins.